Thank you. Now, if we could call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 4 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. As members are well aware, we'll be hearing from several human rights organizations tonight and humanitarian organizations as well. Just a quick reminder to those present here tonight, please do follow the recommendations from public health authorities as well as the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on October 19th, 2021. All participants should also know that translation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of their screen. When there is 30 seconds left in your speaking time, I will provide a gentle reminder. I'd like to welcome our first panelists, and this session will go on till 7:20. We're very, very honored and privileged to have with us today Ms. Ketty Nivia Bandi, the Secretary General of Amnesty International. We have Madame France-Isabelle Langlois, the Executive Director of Amnesty International Canada Francophone. And we also have Mr. Hillel Neuer, the Executive Director of UN Watch. A particular thank you to Mr. Neuer, as I know there is a significant time gap between Ottawa and Geneva. Now, each of our witnesses do have 5 minutes, and we will start with Ms. Nivia Bandi. Thank you, Ms. Nivia Bandi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, dear members of the committee. I'd like to start by thanking the committee for inviting Amnesty International to speak to the state of human rights globally. We're certainly meeting at a grim time. So there are several grave and urgent situations that merit your attention: China, Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, West Cameroon, among others. And I would be happy to brief you further on these in the future. But today, as requested, I will focus my intervention on a few crises that are not widely covered in the Canadian media. And I'd like to start with one exception. That's the ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine. To bring the committee up to speed with our latest information, Amnesty International has verified irrefutable evidence of Russia's violation on international humanitarian law by using ballistic missiles and other explosive weapons in densely populated areas. These are very inaccurate explosive weapons. They regularly miss their targets by half a kilometer or more, and they cause civilian deaths and severe injuries. Their use in populated areas is absolutely inexcusable. We've also documented other incidents in the first hours of the Russian invasion on February 24th, including 4 schools and 1 hospital. 1 rocket dropped cluster munitions on a nursery and kindergarten in Sumy Oblast, where civilians were sheltering from the fighting, killing several civilians, including Alisa Elsan, a 7-year-old little girl, and wounding another child. This strike may constitute a war crime and should be investigated as such. And these heinous crimes, as well as Russia's crackdown on anti-war protesters and domestic media, needs to be thoroughly investigated. Now to key countries and themes. I'll start with Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. After 4 years of extensive research and analysis, Amnesty International released a report earlier this month, which documents how Israel enforces a system of oppression and domination against the Palestinian people wherever it has control over their rights. This includes inside Israel, in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as displaced refugees in other countries. Our 274 pages research and analysis details how Israel's appalling treatment of Palestinians meets the definition of apartheid, a crime against humanity under international law as defined in the Rome Statute and the Apartheid Convention. Decades of deliberate and equal treatment have left Palestinians marginalized, impoverished, and in a state of constant fear and insecurity. And as we speak, Palestinians are being forced out of their home, separated from families, and confined to checkpoints and walls. This report joins a large body of reporting from Palestinian, Israeli, and international organizations who have arrived at the same legal conclusion. It is an important wake-up call. The scale and the seriousness of the violations documented make it clear that the international community and Canada need to urgently change its approach. It is increasingly unsustainable for Canada to avoid grappling with these concurring conclusions. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, and Canada has an obligation to act under international law. The other situation I'd like to highlight is Ethiopia and the conflict in Tigray, which broke out in 2020 and has spread to other regions of Ethiopia since. We reported on the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, attack on Nifas Mechwa in the Amhara region in mid-August 2021. And survivors described being raped at gunpoint, robbed, subjected to physical and verbal assaults by TPLF fighters who also destroyed and looted medical facilities. 14 of the 16 women that Amnesty interviewed said they were gang raped. The scale and the brutality of the sexual violence faced by women and girls is staggering, and the acts they described committed by those fighters and also by all parties in the conflict amount to war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity. I'd also like to quickly bring your attention to Guatemala. Over the past years, remarkable efforts were made to bring those responsible for crimes against humanity and genocide to justice. These are now being undone systemically by the Guatemalan government effort to weaken the rule of law and persecute anti-corruption officials in particular. We're also seeing legislation to restrict civic space, and we invite the committee to carefully monitor this space. Still in the Americas region, we are equally concerned about the deteriorating human rights crisis in Nicaragua and alarming rates of femicides and gender-based violence across the Americas, which have only increased during the pandemic. And then lastly, I'd like to raise the safety of human rights defenders at risk. And we continue to press Canada to create means for defenders under threat to be able to get out quickly when they need to. So thank you for your time and for your attention. I hope I haven't gone over my 5 minutes.
Timing was perfect to the second. Now we will turn to Madame Langlois, please.
Vous êtes toujours en sourdine.
Sorry. Vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me now? Good evening, and thank you to the committee for its invitation. The stakes of human rights at large are very serious, and there are direct attacks on democracy and human rights. Democracies are threatened from the outside as well as the inside. Various movements, populist tendencies is a real threat to our democracy. Even a country like Canada should take this threat very seriously and do everything possible to counter it here and abroad. Authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, on a military basis is not at all reassuring. They are in contravention of international law. Parallel to this situation, we must also underline the border countries to Russia, such as Ukraine, Poland, who are being led by countries of far right-leaning, with the assistance of those from the Middle East. The context of the war in Ukraine, individuals, even if they are of Ukrainian nationality, are having to refuse this. The courage of thousands of Russian civilians who are threatened with their very life have become opposition factor. We shouldn't ignore them, and we should help them out. Canada must also support the Pacific Iraq population in Syria, which has been suppressed Hundreds of individuals have been arrested, imprisoned under serious and very ambiguous charges. Amnesty International Canada, Francophone, was confronted with military people in civilian dress, subject to terrorist acts. Canada should do all possible to ensure that these people be brought back and, of course, to assist all pacifists. These regimes are using social media to combat this. In Saint-Louis, we're waiting for word of liberation today. He's been in jail. He's not a Canadian, but his wife and children are. Canada has to implement every mechanism possible so that he may be brought back to integrate his family. He's been out of the country for 10 years. We hope that the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, which is hindering Canada's efforts to liberate this gentleman, this should be condemned roundly and soundly for the offenses against civilians in Saudi Arabia. They should never intervene with human rights. It's imperative that Canada will remove these patents for medical purposes as a sanction. 4% of the most vulnerable countries have been vaccinated. This involves the health of millions of individuals. There are all sorts of other conflicts throughout the world, and unfortunately, these are legion. The Americas is the continent where we have the greatest and highest number of these attacks on journalists, for example. In West Africa are taking civilian populations as hostage, and they are taken as targets. Anybody working for an NGO, for example, is a potential victim. Canada has invested seriously in Afghanistan and in Haiti. Today, these populations are been abandoned to violence, economic sanctions, and famine. Canada can no longer sit on its hands. I also stress the latest report of Amnesty International after detailed reports on the occupied territories in Palatinate. It's an apartheid policy by the State of Israel vis-à-vis the Palestinians. The show, of course, is a fact, and it did occur. Anti-Semitism is always present throughout the world, including here. But this cannot excuse or explain that a policy of apartheid in Israel be conducted against the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Long.
Thank you very much, Madame Langlois.
Mr. Neuer of UN Watch, my apologies. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here testifying before the committee, and I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts from the United Nations Human Rights Council, where I'm speaking to you here in Geneva. The 2022 session just opened, and sadly, although the founding resolution of the Council 60/251, which was adopted in 2006 when the Council was created as a body to reform the Human Rights Commission, although members were supposed to be those upholding the highest standards, we see the very opposite. We see that dictatorships are increasing in their audacity in human rights abuses and in their audacity to join the Human Rights Council. The current membership of the Council is the worst that it's ever been. 68.1% of the Council failed to meet minimal democracy standards. And I'd like to put a spotlight on some of those countries that are abusing their positions at the UN. We have China, which is a member of the Council, has herded 1 million Muslims into camps. We have Cuba, a member of the Council, which is a communist tyranny now for more than 6 decades and has been committing widespread human rights abuses in the past year, arresting hundreds of democratic, peaceful protesters and putting them in prison and now on trial. We have Eritrea, a member of the Human Rights Council, which has a system of slave labor. We have Libya, a member of the Human Rights Council, which tortures tortures African migrants and puts them up for sale in slave markets. We have Mauritania, a member of the Human Rights Council, which is considered by Amnesty International, by The Guardian and CNN as the last bastion of slavery in the world. We have Pakistan, a member of the Human Rights Council, which systematically persecutes minorities, religious minorities in particular, and hosts terrorist groups. We have Russia, of course, it's already been addressed, but the terrible atrocities that are taking place now in its invasion and assault on Ukraine. But let's not forget at home that Russia is a country that poisons dissidents, people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, people like Alexei Navalny. We have Somalia, member of the Human Rights Council, which is one of the worst situations of female genital mutilation. A member of the Human Rights Council, we have Venezuela, where 5 million have fled due to oppression and the collapse of the state due to failed policies. We have other countries sitting on the human rights bodies, such as Iran, which in a few weeks will join the UN Women's Rights Commission, known as the Commission on the Status of Women, and it's a country that systematically subjugates women. I'd like to put a brief spotlight on some situations that are of particular note and looking at the cases of political prisoners. I'd like to put a spotlight on Felix Maradiaga, who is an opposition leader who was recently convicted just on Wednesday, along with 6 other Nicaraguan political and business leaders, including 3 would-be presidential candidates. They were convicted of conspiring to damage the country's sovereignty, effectively a charge akin to treason, and they'll be sentenced soon. They're among a group of almost 50 political student, peasant and business leaders, journalists, human rights activists who were detained by Mr. Ortega's security forces last summer as he quashed potential opposition in preparation for the November election, which he won easily by detaining 7 of his would-be candidates. So I think we need to put a greater spotlight, certainly in Canada, on the case of people like Felix Maradiaga, and I hope that happens. Moving over to Africa, we have Zimbabwe, where I'd like to put a focus on one particular human rights defender, Hopewell Shinono, an award-winning journalist and filmmaker who won CNN's African Journalist of the Year. In 2020, he published an expose alleging corruption in the administration of President Mnangagwa, and his reporting forced the government to fire the health minister, but also resulted in his arrest on baseless charges. He's been arrested for the 3rd time in 6 months in January 2021 on charges of, quote, communicating falsehoods that aim to silence him. In Cuba, we have, as I mentioned, systematic oppression. I'd like to put a focus on Hamlet Labastida, a Cuban visual artist, political activist, who was the founder of Cuba's most prominent artist-led campaign group, the San Isidro Movement. He was imprisoned on June 26, 2021, arrested for ideas that he shared with members of the artist activist group to stamp Cuban currency with subversive anti-communist symbols. He spent 3 months incarcerated in Villa Marista, the high-security prison famous for holding political prisoners. He was released in September, but only on the condition that he would go into forced exile. Finally, for political prisoners, I'd like to put a spotlight on Nahid Tajavi, a German-Iranian woman who was arrested and sentenced to prison in August, charged with participating in illegal propaganda activities against the regime. She's 66 years old. She was given a prison sentence of 10 years and 8 months, arrested at her Tehran apartment in October 2020, and has been held at Tehran's Evin prison. She's known as an advocate for human rights in Iran, in particular for women's rights and freedom of expression. As I mentioned, all of these countries hold positions of power at the UN. Iran is joining the Women's Rights Commission. Cuba's on the Human Rights Council.
And second,
Nicaragua sits on the committee that oversees human rights NGOs. I will just conclude with mentioning that I disagree with Amnesty International completely in their comments about the situation in Israel. I've spent a lot of time there, and there are problems there, but to accuse it, as they have done, of apartheid is absurd. Israel has full equality for Arabs.
Conclude your
who
testimony,
vote
please.
And are elected, and has an Arab party in the government. So as French President Macron recently said, this accusation is absurd on its face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. Thank you to all 3 of our witnesses. Now we will turn the floor to questions, and each member will have 7 minutes. And we begin with Ms. Vandenbeld.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for being here this evening. I understand that it is a very broad topic, and I also know that we can't begin a meeting today of the Human Rights Subcommittee without acknowledging the tremendous human rights abuses that are happening in Ukraine right now. I know there's a debate going on in the chamber at the moment, but I think that all of us here are very united in standing with Ukraine. I do want to ask some specific questions because I noted that all three of you have talked about particular geographic areas. But what I would like to know is, I know that over the last decade or two, there have been significant advances in gender equality, in SRHR, and in alleviating sexual violence against women and girls around the world. There are still, obviously, horrible conditions in certain places. But my question to you is, with the current backsliding of democracy and human rights, with the rise in authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world, and particularly, I'd like Ms. Nivea Bandi to start, mostly because she's a constituent of mine, but I'd like each of the witnesses to then step in. But I know, Ms. Nivea Bandi, you mentioned Tigray and the sexual violence that's happening against women and girls there. If you could perhaps comment on whether this is something that is increasing globally, whether there are areas in particular where this is a particular problem, and what is the state currently on sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls?
Thank you for that important question, Honorable Vanderberg. So, yes, the short answer to your question is yes, women's rights have been backsliding. And what we notice is that wherever human rights in general are backsliding, then inevitably women's rights also backslide. And particularly in the context of armed conflict. So we know that sexual and gender-based violence is a weapon of war, and wherever there are armed conflicts, then there's a high likelihood of, or we can assume that there are women's rights are being violated, and particularly through sexual violence. So with the increase of armed conflict that we're seeing globally, we are definitely noticing an increasing trend, an increase towards violence towards women. I would add to that as authoritarianism and advances, and you have more challenges that are placed around democracy. At the same time, civil society organizations that advance women's rights also tend to be the most affected. I think all panelists have spoken about the risks that civil society faces in various countries. The large majority of names that you heard were male. What happens is that when those figures who normally enjoy a certain privilege because of their gender status are targeted, we can assume that women, civil society leaders who are advancing this work are at an even greater risk. And we see that particularly in the African continent, and I would say in the Americas, where we have this staggering numbers of femicides that are increasing across the region. We're seeing a high number of women human rights defenders who were advancing sexual and reproductive rights being on the run. Likewise for LGBTQI plus defenders as well. And the numbers that we keep seeing are really, they're really staggering, particularly in the Americas, especially in Mexico, when we have a really high rate of femicide. So I would say, yes, this is a trend, and I think it's important that we constantly connect the two and understand that as rights are getting assaulted, then women's rights are definitely seeing a decrease as well. And I would just add, with the rise of a lot of far-right movements as well, we see this having a direct repercussions on women's rights globally.
Thank you. Madame Langlois, est-ce que vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Ms. Langlois, would you like to add anything? Ms. Langlois? No, I believe my colleague expressed it very, very clearly. I'd like to give the floor to someone else.
I do have another question, and actually, Ms. Nivya Bandi, you touched on it a little bit in terms of the rise of far-right extremist movements and the impact on gender and on human rights. And this is the rapid expansion of disinformation and the spread of disinformation within different countries around the world. I was wondering if either of you could comment on that and on the impact that is having on human rights globally. Who would like to begin?
Sure, I can start if that's okay. I think that's a very valid point, and I would add disinformation in the digital age. A lot of the fight for women's rights and for feminist principles as well is actually being done by leaders, feminist leaders, and civil society, women's rights leaders who are operating increasingly in the digital space, because that is a sort of a freer space for them to be able to advance their rights. And they are faced with extreme harassment, threats, disinformation, attacks on their persons and their families as well, their reputation. And we see all sorts of lies being fabricated about these women, which then follow them in their day-to-day life. So a lot of the women's rights leaders that we've worked with and women human rights defenders we've worked with and who are either on the run or are fleeing have been targeted online. And this is a growing trend that we're seeing. We've seen it actually even here in Canada with some Indigenous Indigenous land defenders as well, who are under a mob, what I would call a digital mob, and who are placed at high risk. So I wanted to put that digital context to you as well.
Yes, thank you. And that was what I was referring to. I don't know if I have any more time, Mr. Chair. No? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Belt. Now we turn to Mr. Viersen. You have 7 minutes.
I'll share my time with Mr. Cooper as well. Mr. Cooper? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Neuer. Mr. Neuer, like you, I take issue with the suggestion that Israel is the number one human rights issue in the world, a thriving democracy with an independent judiciary who has a strong track record overall when it comes to human rights. And now I want to address a specific issue, namely the recent nomination of the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, the nomination which occurred last Thursday, the person nominated being Francesco Albanese. Do you have concerns with this nomination?
Your mic.
If you could unmute.
Thank you for that timely question, because the appointment is about to happen in a few weeks. And indeed, I do have concerns about the nominee for this position as Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, and those concerns would have been expressed by Stéphane Dion, Canada's Foreign Minister, several years ago, in regard to the current mandate holder 6 years ago, Michael Lynk, when he was nominated. Canada's Foreign Minister at the time, Stéphane Dion, said that the nomination violated the Council's principles of objectivity and impartiality because the candidate at that time, Michael Lynk, had a lengthy record of making prejudicial statements and engaging in campaigning to target Israel and was not objective or impartial, and it was motivated by political considerations. In this case, the candidate, once again, is a product of a politicized process. Francesca Albanese is a lifelong campaigner against Israel. She has accused Israel of being a racist state, a colonial state, and her husband is someone who has worked for the Palestinian government. These are conflicts of interest that she has not disclosed, but this is just sort of an additional thing that she is a lifelong anti-Israel lobbyist. She does not hide that. So the Canadian ambassador here several years ago Ambassador Goldberg, when she was sitting on the consultative group, she tried to select someone named Christine Cerna, who had no record of politicization and bias, and that was rejected by the council. And the Arab and Islamic countries said they specifically want someone who, quote unquote, is an expert. What they meant, they wanted someone who was completely anti-Israel. And that is contrary to the founding resolutions of the council, which require someone to be impartial and objective. There's no question a brief review of her application of Francesca Albanese will see that she has been a lifelong campaigner for the Palestinian cause. She supports, quote unquote, resistance, which she's not shy that includes violence against Israel. She is completely inappropriate. And I do hope that the Canadian government, as they did 6 years ago when Michael Link was nominated wrongly and they called for a review, I hope they do the same thing prior to the appointment, which will take place in about 4 weeks' time. I hope that the Canadian government expresses their support for the founding principles of the council, which require impartiality and not the opposite, politicization.
Well, thank you for that. And among other things, she has attended an event of an organization linked to Hamas. You note the rules of the council as defined by resolutions 5.1 and 1621 in terms of impartiality and objectivity that are to be of a paramount importance. So I think it would be fair to say she doesn't come close to meeting that requirement.
That is absolutely the case. And there was a law professor in McGill who has written on this phenomenon where certain individuals are chosen not despite their prejudicial statements and their bias, but precisely because of it. And he was referring to someone who was appointed at the time of the Goldstone report. But sadly, this is becoming systematic at the Human Rights Council. The most significant mechanism to target Israel is the Commission of Inquiry that they created in May, which was put forward by Pakistan and the Palestinian delegation. And the person they appointed was Navi Pillay, who's the former UN rights chief, but she's someone who in the past 2 years has actively lobbied governments to, and I'm quoting, sanction Israeli apartheid. She signed this statement in 2020 to lobby governments. She signed another manifesto in June 2021 that condemned Israel for committing crimes during the last war. And she absurdly has been appointed to head an inquiry into whether Israel is racist and whether it committed crimes when she's already lobbied governments on precisely that point. I used to be an attorney, and if you go before a judge and ask that judge to recuse himself or herself, you would immediately achieve that result. We've submitted a 30-page recusal request, and we hope that Navi Pillay will recuse herself, and we hope that all other civil society groups that are committed to the principles of impartiality that oblige commissioners to have that impartiality will speak out in this regard.
Thank you for that. And we have now a nominee who fails to satisfy even the most minimal standards of impartiality. But Mr. Noor, I'd be interested if you could elaborate a little bit on the mandate of the special rapporteur and the discriminatory nature of the mandate of the rapporteur and any recommendations that you would have for Canada to take in light of that.
Yes, the mandate was created in February 1993. It goes back nearly 3 decades, and it even predates the Oslo Accords when the Palestinian Authority entered Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, cities that they control, and Jenin and Bethlehem, and Hamas rules Gaza. So the mandate predates that. It's the only mandate that only looks at one side. The other special rapporteurs, whether it's on Sudan, will look at all sides. And we'll look at the human rights situation in a region. This one, as the current mandate holder has acknowledged, only looks at one side. It looks at, quote, its mandate is to investigate, quote, Israel's violations of the principles and bases of international law. It does not look at abuses by the Palestinian Authority, terrorism by the
Mr.
PA,
Neuer, your time is up.
Hamas
If you could
and
wrap it up,
Islamic
please.
Jihad terrorism by Islamic Jihad, the PA, and Hamas are systematically ignored. They're presumed to be violations, and that is why Amnesty International in the past and other groups have said that
Is
this
up.
bias
If you could
is
wrap it up, please.
one-sided. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we turn to Mr. Trudel. Vous avez 7 minutes. Mr. Trudel, we can't hear you. If you could unmute.
Oui, bon, je suis désolé. Bon.
Yes, I apologize. I wanted to take the mic earlier, but I'm having trouble with the camera. But anyway, it's a bit like a horror film. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their attendance this evening. This is very interesting and very important discussion. We have to have this discussion. My first question would be for Ms. Nivia Bandi and Ms. Langlois. Talking about Ukraine today, it's a very serious situation, as my colleague has said earlier. There's a debate in the House, actually, at this moment. The prosecutor of the International Court is calling for an inquiry. He's already talking about crimes against humanity, war crimes, potentially. It hasn't even been a week since this conflict erupted. Could you speak about it a little bit more? What is this prosecutor of the International Court getting at? And Ms. Nivia Bandi first, please.
Well, I think I addressed this at the start of my remarks. Indeed, what we have seen and what we've been able to document as Amnesty, amounts to war crimes and certainly needs to be investigated. So, in fact, we are calling for the ICC indeed to investigate on these war crimes and these crimes against humanity. It's a possibility. But also for a special rapporteur to be appointed for Russia to investigate as well and to report on Russia's human rights violations in Ukraine. It is clear that in just a few days, what we've seen is absolutely appalling. We're looking at over 150,000 people who've already fled the country. We've seen children killed, civilians killed in indiscriminate attacks directed to populated areas, things that are forbidden, prohibited under international law, including clustered munitions, as I mentioned earlier. All these crimes are heinous and need to be fully investigated. I do want to mention that, and I think that's moving in the right direction. Today we've seen the Emergency General Assembly meeting being convened for the first time in 40 years on this case. I would like to note that we're seeing actually, in the case of Ukraine, although we're seeing incredible violations on the part of Russia, we're actually witnessing the international system functioning and international law, getting into motion. We're seeing a strong response, the kind of response that we haven't seen for all conflicts globally, to be honest. And I hope that this will be an opportunity to be able to redress that and to shift. We've seen refugees being welcomed, actions taken really promptly, sanctions taken very quickly, things that we don't see for other crises. And I think this crisis certainly sets the benchmark for the future.
Madame Langlois.
Brièvement, je peux.
Well, quite briefly, I could repeat what my colleague has just said. But the cluster munitions, for example, are an infraction of international law. They are forbidden. There's been bombardments close to schools and hospitals. This should be avoided, of course, according to the rule of law. The invasion of Ukraine under false pretexts to begin with is also an infraction of international law. So from the onset, we're already beyond the law internationally. Thank you. I'd like to perhaps Aref Badawi, Ms. Langlois, it's 10 years today, I believe, that he should have been released. I don't think that that's the case right now. We would be aware of it. So what should we do now? How do we respond and react to this as of now? How can Canada intervene at this point? If Mr. Badawi is freed in the next few weeks or months, how can Canada intervene so that he can return to Canada to be reunited with his family? Well, thank you for the question. We're still awaiting the liberation of Mr. Badawi, May, June, perhaps. The calendar that we're using, whether it's a Islamic calendar or our own calendar, the liberation date or release date, 28th of February, or perhaps June. We're fairly confident that he will, in fact, be released because 18 months ago, defenders of human rights of prisoners in Saudi Arabia, where the sentence has been completed, served, there was an arrangement taken to release these people, but release in quotes. Most of these individuals, if not all of them, once released from prison, are encouraged to leave the country. Mr. Badawi is prohibited from leaving the country. We certainly hope he will be released, but we have to continue mobilizing. Canada must continue insisting for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia release Mr. Badawi so he can reintegrate Canada. He's not a Canadian, but his family is, his wife and children. And Canada's opinion will serve. Other countries also are joining this attempt to increase the pressure, so that he be released. Ms. Langlois, well, it's changed countries. I don't have much time, but I'd like to talk about a very specific case of Mr. Lazare Junior, part of Canadian citizen in this case. He was arrested in Algeria last week. He has 2 visas, but the Algerian government will not recognize the validity of those visas, the Canadian visa. Over the last few weeks or months, they've repeated this kind of action. They imprison people who they are suspected of terrorism, but there are people who are simply fighting for democracy in Algeria. How can Canada react to this, and how can we liberate these people? Well, Canada has to speak out loud and defend rigorously what's going on in Algeria. It's been 3 years that the population have been fighting diligently for democracy. There's been many, many imprisonments, long sentences, and we should be very concerned and act on the diplomatic front. Madame Langlois is considered a Canadian, and Canada should be defending his rights as they would any other Canadian. Thank you, Madame Langlois. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Trudel.
Thank you, Mr. Trudel.
You have 7 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. In 7 minutes, it's going to be very difficult to ask questions on human rights throughout the world. It's a big world out there. I'd like to begin with the interesting report that Amnesty International has presented of the situation in Palestine. I am not the first to say Human Rights Watch did a similar job or report recently. In 2018, I was part of a delegation, parliamentary delegates, to visit the occupied territories in the West Bank, and we were able to speak with various citizens, and we saw that it was a military opposition, control, a wall, and the daily humiliation of the Palestinian people who don't make the headlines. There's no active military bombing going on, but it's a spiteful treatment of the population. In Hebron, for example, collective punishment. We destroy homes to make space for illegal occupation and construction. So I'd like to hear more from Ms. Nivya Bandi, which leads you to the conclusion that using the expression apartheid to describe what is the situation of Palestinian populations right now. Concrete examples, please. Okay, I thought maybe someone else was going to start, but I can comment.
English again. So yes, thank you for that question. And I just want to point out that often when we hear apartheid, I think people associate it immediately with South Africa, with the context of South Africa. And it's important to note that apartheid looks different in different situations. In international law, what it actually means is a systematic, prolonged, cruel, discriminatory treatment of one racial group members towards another with the intention to control the other group. So what you're pointing out is indeed part of what we have observed over the past 4 years. And my first call will be to encourage you and encourage this committee perhaps to do this, what you did a few years ago, and to visit this for yourselves. Some of the examples of this system that we've observed are, for instance, severe movement restrictions in the West Bank, which are enforced through a network of checkpoints and road closures with permit systems, which force Palestinians who want to visit other areas of the occupied Palestinian territories to seek the permission of the Israeli military. We've seen the denial of nationality to Palestinian citizens of Israel, or the systematic denial of building permits to Palestinians in East Jerusalem, but also the expansion of illegal settlements in East Jerusalem as well. The denial, and this is why we extend our definition of apartheid beyond Israel and the OPT to displaced Palestinians, the denial of Palestinian refugees internationally protected rights to return. Israel bars Palestinian families who have been displaced for generations to return to their former villages. And then we also see restrictions on access to land and fishing areas in the Gaza region, for instance. And there are statistics that are, speak to this in more detail. But when you look at all these elements together, and rather than in a fragmented manner, when you look at all these various elements together, including the crimes of forcible transfer, detention and torture, unlawful killings and injuries, and the denial of basic rights, all these crimes and systems put together, so the pattern of laws, policies, and practices together then amounts to apartheid under international law, the definition that it has in the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute. So that has been our approach and our conclusion.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Nivya Bandi.
Thank you very much, Madam Nivya Bandi. I also observed quite a few troubling things. Bus circuits and routes that are prohibited from Palestinian use, roads that can't be used. I don't understand how in a 21st century you think that in a democracy such as Israel that they would respect human rights. A number of other things struck me as quite exceptional. The arrest and prosecution of children by Israeli military forces. We met a group of lawyers who are defending the rights of these children, young adolescents, often stopped for having thrown stones or some other behavior. And is that part and parcel of your analysis of the infraction of human rights in this area? Well, yes, of course. But to continue with what my colleague was saying, these are the daily humiliations that Palestinians live with. Repression, which is quite disproportionate to the actual reality. Number of cases of young persons, also adults, who find themselves imprisoned under all sorts of pretexts and have to face justice, which is completely arbitrary, at a long list, but particularly for the youth, children, in fact, is very, very shocking. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chairman? 10 seconds. Well, thank you.
And at this juncture, allow me to, on behalf of the entire committee, thank all three of the witnesses, not only for their testimony, but for their time. We're very, very grateful. Now, if the members will allow, we will suspend for 5 minutes to do sound check for the next set of panelists. Thank you. For this segment and for the second panel, we have two speakers. Regrettably, we had technical challenges with the witness from the International Committee of the Red Cross. But we will proceed with Mr. Nuri Turkel, the Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and with Ms. Denise Burns, the General Director of Oxfam Quebec. Now, just as a reminder, for translation, you do have the globe at the bottom of your screen.
Mr. Chair, just a point of order. Could we ask that if we are able to connect with the ICRC, that we could interrupt and hear from them at whatever, if they can get on? Yeah. Thank you.
That makes eminent sense, for sure. Now, if we could start off with Mr. Nuri Turkel. Welcome, Mr. Turkel. You have 5 minutes for your opening testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me to testify on this important topic, which has been my expertise and focus on my professional and personal life, if I would say. I'm a vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom after being appointed as a commissioner by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in May 2020. But today I'm testifying in my own capacity as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where I am specialized on foreign affairs, global justice, and human rights issues. I'm cognizant of the critical time at which this important hearing falls.
My apologies, Mr. Turkel. The interpreters are having some challenges. If you could move the mic farther up, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of the critical time at which this important hearing falls. The current crisis in Ukraine represents a critical juncture we have to come in battle with between liberal democracy and growing spread of authoritarian brutalities. I'm deeply inspired by the bravery of the Ukrainian people resisting Putin's aggression and invasion. The Canadian government has played a key role ensuring accountability for human rights violators and full mental of the responsibility that has not been assumed yet. The response over the past 5 days to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is a demonstration that we can muster willpower and tools to find these bad actors. And this is the same vigor that has been applied to the crisis I want to highlight today. The Uyghur genocide could have been stopped a long time ago. Where is the utilization of global sanctions? The pursuit of justice must be equally applied to malicious state actors like China. We have just recently observed the aftermath of Beijing 2022 Winter Games, another stain on human history. As the international community, IOC, the sponsors affirmed Beijing's standing in front of the entire world, this genocide has been ongoing for years, following the warning signs and build up to the genocide that we likewise ignored in favor of the willful naivete that insisted on believing that China would reform under the CCP. This thinking is ignorant of reality and recent history. Irreparable damages to the Uyghur people is already a reality given the tepid, disastrous, slow international response to this staggering 21st century high-tech genocide. Millions of Uyghurs have been interned in concentration camps and factories where they have been utilized as a slave labor for major global and international corporations. Thousands of mosques have been destroyed. The Uyghur children are no longer being born as forced abortion and sterilizations have been utilized to wipe out the next generation. The Uyghur diaspora remains cut off from their loved ones, living in the so-called free outside world while bearing the agony of constant fear and burden of survivors' guilt. All the while, they are frequently directly tormented by the Chinese regime itself with the calls and treats part of the Uyghur existence. No place beyond the regime's grasp, including Canada. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are not the mere instigators of the chaos in our world. They are symptoms of deep-rooted problems, like the likes of which must be addressed with courage and conviction. I personally can attest that China is not a good faith actor with which we can continue to believe that typical diplomacy will work. As we look back on the history, we can see the refusing counter bad actors and dictatorial regimes only embolden them. The incentive structures for Chinese officials, for example, themselves, as well as international organizations, corporations to provide cover for the Chinese regime must be broken. Canada, alongside of our allies and partners, must follow 2021's joint sanction and apply them broadly to all Chinese Communist Party officials tied to the Uyghur genocide. Never again must be a reality. The time has come for Canada to impose real consequences on the handmaidens of Xi Jinping. We cannot fail to ensure that the horrors of Uyghur people have undergone do not expand and are not repeated in targeted other vulnerable groups, such as the Muslims in India. As the Indian government drives the country increasingly down a Hindu nationalistic path, vulnerable minorities are at risk. Today, we're experiencing genocide in China. Who will know which vulnerable religious ethnic groups will be next? The environment has already begun to resemble that of the oppressed one, such as the one created by the Communist Party in China. They are targeting religious groups, particularly Muslims in India. When we look at the issues like this, confronting this kind of global challenges, it requires collective individual responses from the liberal democracies. Canada has been a strong partner in the efforts to address the genocide, including in the UN and with the coordinated sanctions early last year. But Canada could do much more. To begin, Canada could create a refugee program, accept 10,000 Uyghur refugees from a third country. The urgency of this issue has become more and more apparent as Uyghurs all over the world who have managed to escape are at risk of deportation back into the hands of the murderous regime in Beijing. As Canada strives to combat climate change, recognize that 48% of the polysilicon...
Mr. Turkel, if I could ask that you wrap up in the next 15 seconds, please.
Sure. The world is waking up to the need to end the brutal regime in dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping. Should we fail to take the decisive leadership, we will be counted among the cowards and criminals of the history. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions that I can highlight and articulate some of the key issues that involves China and other parts of the world that the minorities, religious groups have been subject to human rights violations.
Thank you, Mr. Turkel. Now we turn to Ms. Burns from Oxfam, Quebec. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Burns.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us today. I'm here to testify for Oxfam, but as you know, Oxfam works in the field in response to humanitarian needs and long-term development. We are directly in contact with those who are suffering from these. Since the COVID epidemic, we have seen some very great difficulties and inequality among these various civilian populations. We've also concluded that to assist and defend defenders of human rights and help those organizations which try to provide humanitarian aid in conflicted countries will demand government action. External affairs, for example, diplomatic efforts must be brought to bear. Talk about Yemen, for example. We can't do this piecemeal. Yemen is a crisis which is somewhat forgotten in the media, but it's one of the worst humanitarian crises according to the United Nations. 2/3 of the population depend on humanitarian aid just to survive. Women and children in particular are suffering from severe food insecurity. For over 7 years now, there's been over 19,000 civilian deaths, and 2022 has been one of the most difficult years in terms of attack. They're destroying the potable water system. It's a fundamental right, access to water, potable water. Hospitals have been attacked. We understand that this is being aided by arms coming from Saudi Arabia, and Canada cannot guarantee that our sale of military equipment is not being used. Inquiries have been done on that without any positive conclusions. Canada is a signatory to arms trade conventions and must suspend the export of military equipment to Saudi Arabia, as other countries have done: Austria, Belgium, Germany, Greece, Netherlands, among others. It's our duty to protect. This has been going on for years, and there's no international convention that would apply to Ukraine, for example. The system is, people are doing what they can. We're doing concerted sanctions. And Yemen, abandoned and forgotten. The Canadian government could and should act in order to play a much more significant role. This will take an intergovernmental approach. Last point on Yemen. In 81, the organization designated by the United Nations to supervise or monitor rights respect or lack thereof. It would be very important to create another independent mechanism to replace this group of experts or panel of experts to observe and monitor what's going on in Yemen for the populations that are directly involved. Well, there's been a lot said on Palestine this evening. I had things to say, but I'd rather talk about the Latin American situation. In Colombia and Honduras, we see a rise in violence against human rights defenders. Very concerning. They're victims of harassment, surveillance, smear campaigns, threats, arbitrary detentions, criminalization, physical attacks, disappearances, and assassination. Indigenous and racialized defenders are particularly at risk when they try to protect their territories and natural resources from the development and proliferation of extractive industry, tourism projects, or extensive monocultures. Particularly concerned is the smear campaigns targeting women leaders, women in society, particularly Indigenous women, and attack their role in society as well as their sexuality. Also of concern, the violence against LGBTQ plus communities, particularly those who try to defend the rights of this community. In Colombia, unfortunately, has the highest number of assassinated defenders in 2021. Half of those killed in the world defending rights are Colombian, 53%. It's shocking. Central America, Latin America.
Conclude in approximately 15 seconds.
OK. Ben, c'est la violence basée sur le genre.
Well, violence based on gender is particularly significant. We've seen a large increase, as we have seen recently in Honduras. Even the day after birth control pill is banned, they even overturned the decision of the Constitutional Court. We're quite concerned with this situation.
Now, we're fortunate to be joined by Mr. Jeremy England from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. England, you have 5 minutes for your testimony, and it will be followed up by questions from the members. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, chers amis.
Mr. Chairman, members of Parliament, thank you very much for this opportunity to have a discussion with you. We are in close cooperation, of course, with the Government of Canada, and our mandate, of course, is to support not only our work, but also for the defense of international humanitarian law, which is becoming more and more significant and important day by day. I'm talking about international humanitarian law.
War. And this brings me to my organization. The ICRC was born on the battlefields of Europe based on two ideas. The first being that there should be a set of minimum humanitarian standards, and protections during warfare. This was the origin of the Geneva Conventions and wider humanitarian frameworks that we all know today. And this body of law is distinct from the human rights law that many of our colleagues have spoken about and underpin some of the specific concerns that they raised. Humanitarian law is universal and is non-derogable. What I mean by that is it cannot be waived under a state of emergency. So this law, this international humanitarian law, applies fully today in Ukraine as it does in Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, or elsewhere. When we speak of IHL, we speak of protection that should be afforded to those people affected by conflict. We also speak about the obligations on those people who are conducting conflict and on the obligations on those seeking to offer humanitarian services during conflict. It defines explicitly the responsibilities that the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations may exercise in today's battlefields. ICRC's mandate is to protect and assist victims of war, and therefore somewhat different from that of human rights organizations. We work differently. We put a premium on neutrality and discretion to assure our access and proximity to those in need. And we exercise our dialogue bilaterally and in confidence to achieve the best possible outcomes on the ground and in policy influence. In that sense, we are complementary to the work of the important work of the human rights actors you've heard so far tonight, and we're a slightly different beast. The other idea that defines the Red Cross movement was that there should be national societies, national relief organizations such as the Canadian Red Cross that can work as independent auxiliaries of their humanitarian services of their governments. So the ICRC remains a specialist conflict-focused arm of this wider Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and the task today is ever more complicated. I would share with you just a few trends and a few asks, a few reminders or suggestions. We are concerned today, as we operate in over 100 countries, employing 22,000 staff members and spending over 3 billion Canadian dollars a year. We are concerned that the conflicts that we are facing are multiplying. They are increasing in duration and in number, and that we're facing an international order today that is increasingly struggling to bring any form of negotiation that can impose peace on these contexts. As great powers shift in their focus from counterterrorism and long-term insurgencies towards global strategic competition, we see more and more assertive regional actors, increased coups as states see opportunities for new alliances. We see a multiplication of non-state armed groups. We count 612 currently in the context where we are working directly. We see increased conflict in urban areas. We see both increased suffering due to that, but also longer-term infrastructural damage caused to that urban conflict. We see the focus shifting rapidly to all the new crises, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, now Ukraine, while nothing is yet solved in Syria or Yemen or Libya or the Sahel or Congo or South Sudan, Myanmar or elsewhere. We see both COVID and climate change impacting conflict, highlighting the inequalities, the corruption, the frustrations, rendering populations ever more vulnerable, and most obviously in the Sahel, but also in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And we see new domains where force is projected, where crime and risk is increased, notably in the cyber domain and around the protection of the data of the people we're trying to assist. Finally, we see ever increasing challenges and expectations on humanitarian organizations in ever decreasing space with which to operate safely. What I mean by that is national governments, non-state armed groups, also the desire to see solutions not coming from former colonial powers, the continued use of sanctions and other restrictive measures by bigger powers and by the United Nations, all impacting on the space in which humanitarian organizations can respond. That leads me to 5 or 4 quick messages.
Mr. England, if you could conclude, please.
Certainly. 4 points. Importance of steady, unearmarked support, the importance of defending humanitarian law, the importance of ensuring that international sanctions always have humanitarian carve-outs and exemptions, and the importance to make sure that counterterrorism legislation does not have unintended consequences for humanitarian actions. Lastly, and most importantly, peacemaking.
I'm going to have to cut you off, Mr. England. Thank you. But we do have an opportunity for questions. We're opening it up for 7 minutes for each member. And the first member is Mr. Samir Zuberi.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll let Mr. England briefly finish his last point as I move into my series of questions.
Sorry, that's very kind of you. I was just saying that the last point was that as humanitarians, we can only prepare the ground and minimize abuses, give people a little bit of hope. What we need is political leadership to uphold a rule-based order, and look for solutions to conflict, and work the multilateral systems towards ending the ever-increasing number of conflicts. We know Canada is a very important player in all the domains I raised, and we thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. And I'll start off my questioning with Mr. Turkel, who I know you're the Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms, and also you're here as a representative of an institute, Hudson Institute. I'm sure you're aware of our subcommittee. We did an extensive report on the situation of the Uyghur people. I'm wondering, first off, if you've gone through that report, and secondly, if you support the findings of our committee when we did that study.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zuberi. I have reviewed the report and I support the initiative, particularly 10,000 Uyghur refugee resettlement aspect of the proposal. We have a similar bill what initiatives been introduced in the United States Congress. This is something that both the U.S. and Canadian government, Parliament, Congress could do in the meantime. The humanitarian assistance is one of the less complicated issues, I would say. It does not involve a diplomatic struggle with respect to China. This is something that urgently needed, specifically in the countries in the Middle East, namely Turkey.
Thank you. So you highlighted Turkey. I hear that as a space where many Uyghurs are currently living in third countries. I want to shift gears for a moment. You did touch briefly upon India. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? You didn't really speak much to it. We have about 5 minutes left in my questions. Not all to you, but just to hear on this particular point.
Sure. That's an important country to focus. As the geopolitical concerns with respect to Indo-Pacific been heightened, governments, including my own, losing sight over the human rights and religious persecution, human rights violation and religious persecution in India with respect to Muslim population. It is inconceivable that a country with a large Muslim population, not too long ago had a Muslim president, now going after this vulnerable group. It is India is a large democracy. I would say that the United States and our allies and partners should have a healthy relationship when these kind of important issues, principal issues, highlighted in our bilateral, multilateral engagement with China, with India, just like the way that we have done it throughout the history with other regimes.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to go now to Mr. England. I actually looked you up and I saw that in 2016, at least, you were the regional director for Bhutan, India, Nepal, and Maldives, and used to live in New Delhi. I'm curious, I'm sure as somebody who's lived in South Asia, you also have kept an eye in terms of the situation of minorities in South Asia. If you'd like to pick up upon Mr. Turkel's comments and maybe zoom out also as whatever you feel is appropriate, but particularly interested in your thoughts around the situation of minorities in India, South Asia.
Thank you very much. Look, I have to admit I've been caught on a number of other crises around the world in the 4 years since then, so I wouldn't pretend to be up to speed on the situation in India right now. The situation for minorities is always of concern in every country, and particularly more so in countries affected directly by conflict. And so our focus is always going to be in those areas where the conflict is more extreme. So I'm afraid I'll have to decline on commenting on South Asia. I wouldn't want to be inaccurate.
Not a problem. And I'll shift gears. I saw Miss Denise Bernes. I'm sorry about the pronunciation of her family name, but if you'd like to speak to that, and I have a question for you afterwards on another matter.
So yes, Denise Burns. I can go in English since you asked me in English.
Whatever you like.
So yeah, the situation in India is of great concern. There's quite a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric from the government, and it's incited a lot of communal violence against Muslims in their own communities. And we're also seeing from the Indian government really actions to limit the actions of civil society organizations that are denouncing these things. So recently in December, they revoked the licenses of 6,000 civil society organizations to receive funds outside the country. So these are humanitarian organizations delivering aid for COVID to like overrun hospitals and to very marginalized communities where people don't have any resources. And overnight, they're losing 75% of their capacity to act. These are hundreds and thousands of people that will not receive aid because of this. And there's definitely a link made between the ones who are cut out and how vocal they have been about the situation of human rights in India, in particular minorities who are being affected.
I hear what you're saying. And in the last minute, you did touch upon Yemen. If you'd like to speak more about that and the nexus, what we can do as Canadians to improve the situation over there.
So yeah, I think there are a couple of things that I mentioned. The first one is to ask questions of the government about where our arms parts for arms are being sent to Saudi Arabia and how that's impacting on the conflict and whether we are inadvertently a party to the conflict through that. So I think that's really important, and that we've been talking about that for some time. I think if we could, bring up. Yemen is not spoken about. So as a humanitarian organization like the Red Cross, we're there delivering humanitarian aid, trying to deliver all people and all parties. But we ourselves have had our own warehouse bombarded. And people that work for us, local Yemenis, have been affected directly, losing members of their family. So if there's some way to bring the conflict up in Parliament, keep it active, because as others take over from the media like Ukraine, which are equally important, Yemen is just lost below, and it's been going on for 7 years, and the population are in a dire humanitarian situation.
100%, and what you're raising here goes into our testimony and raises the issue. Thank you so much to all the witnesses.
Thank you. Now it's Mr. Viersen. You have 7 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming here and giving us kind of the horror show of the world. I just was wondering if I could just touch on something that Mr. Turkel was talking about, just around the forced labor in Southeast Asia, China. Just around how does Canada tie into that? Is he familiar with our supply chain reporting bills that we've been pushing here in our Parliament, and what is the United States doing in terms of that as well, trying to combat this forced labor that happens in other parts of the world?
Forced labor, thank you very much for that important question. Forced labor has been one of the most effective tools that the Chinese government used in its repressive policies with respect to Uyghurs. Now we're hearing disturbing news that the Tibetans also have been subject to forced labor practices. China has effectively, in the last 20 years, polluted the global supply chain with tainted consumer products, electronics, and now the solar panels. More than 80 global brands, according to various reports, have been tainted in the ongoing forced labor practices. Last December, President Biden enacted a substantive bill, a law that become law now in the enforcement posture, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that presumptively treats everything coming from China to the United States as tainted product, unless proven by the importers, by the manufacturers, that these are not tainted or not being made by modern-day slaves. So this issue has to be dealt globally. Same is true in Europe, same is true in Canada, same thing in Australia. This is a global problem. Even the United States enforces some of the toughest, robust legal tools, enforcement mechanism. This cannot be dealt alone. So we also need Canada's help persuading the global businesses, in addition to putting whatever the tools administratively, legislatively could be put in place to pressure the businesses that there's no place for slavery in a modern era. We need to use our consumers. We need to use our tools and our toolboxes, and we also use our pressure on the businesses to force them to do the right thing. The business community has been complicit in the ongoing forced labor practices in China. So this requires Canadian, European, and American joint collaborated approach, a strategic approach to tackle.
Mr. Turkel, you mentioned solar panels. Why in particular did you mention solar panels?
Solar panels, the Uyghur forced labor being used in the polysilicon part of the solar panel industry. The green revolution, the green industry is important. The environment, the earth is in peril, so is the Uyghurs. But we cannot compete with China, Canada, whether it be Canada or the United States, in this important industry because we don't use forced labor. We don't use slavery. They do. Therefore, this is very important that Canada, in tandem with the United States and other countries, to impose strict measures to stop this practice and China's efforts to even confuse the people who cares about green technology that it's okay to put these panels on a roof knowing that it's been made by fellow human beings who have been enslaved. So the solar panel industry is one of the critical areas that has been reportedly using forced labor, the Uyghur forced labor.
Mr. England, I was just wondering if you have any comments around forced labor around the world and if you've interacted with that with your organization.
As you know, we're not a specialist human rights organization, so it's not our principal focus. But it is, we would come across people if they were caught up in conflict, displaced, injured, imprisoned, or separated from their family members due to conflict, but we would not have a specific focus on dealing with the issue of forced labor.
And Ms. Burns?
Yeah, I could. I support what my colleague Mr. Turkel has said, but I could add also that we are seeing a lot of forced labor of children in artisanal mining in West Africa and in Central Africa, and it's going up. And there are many. If I take Burkina Faso, Canada has the highest number of mining companies who are actually active in Burkina Faso, so we do have a role we can play. And it's an area where it's very dangerous. Just last week, there was an explosion in an artisanal mine in Burkina Faso that killed almost 60 people, including children, women and children. So that's an area that isn't in the media so much. We hear a lot about some other areas like the, clothing and chocolate, but in the artisanal mining, children are very present.
What do you mean by artisanal mining?
So these are like open pit, going for gold. It's not industrial mining. It's very, artisanal is like not industrial. So it's like people are in pits, open pits, and they don't have any protection. So they're very challenging contexts, and the human rights abuses are really quite high.
And are these? Would this be state-sanctioned mining? Is it foreign players coming in?
Both. The state's quite aware of it, but there are foreign players who are involved in artisanal mining as well.
Now, one of the challenges that we have as we look around the world, is the human rights abuses. You brought up Yemen as well. We now see the Ukraine. If you could give us one recommendation, hey, this is one area that Canada can really make a difference in the whole scope of the work that you do, Ms. Burns, what would it be?
That's a challenging question. But I think if we can push, I can't say, there's two. One is, I think, mentioned by Jeremy England was the whole question of the role Canada play in pushing peace processes. I think that's really important because if we can stop these conflicts, we're going to stop a lot of the abuse. And the second one, I think, is to have some really robust, laws here in Canada around what we do in the world. So around what our companies are doing, what our organizations are doing in the world, making sure that we're not contributing to these human rights violations and serving as an example. And that would give us, I think, more voice and credibility when we speak as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Viersen. Now we turn to Monsieur Trudel. You have 7 minutes.
Monsieur Trudel, vous avez 7 minutes. You have 7 minutes, Mr. Trudel. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our 3 guests. One subject hasn't yet been raised, and which is of interest to me, perhaps to Ms. Burns and Mr. England, and that is Haiti. It's very, very concerning. I think the numbers, poverty figures are just dramatic. Armed groups have hijacked the country. It's a non-state state, if you will, a failed state almost. And of course, Oxfam, I believe, is present in Haiti. What do you hear on the ground, Ms. Burns? So what's the situation currently? Well, first of all, people continue to work in trying to develop their milieu, their environment. Coffee cultivation, for example, women entrepreneurs are trying to develop their economy. The insecurity, the status of insecurity in the country is a major, major problem. The Haitians themselves, of course, because very often the middle-class children are kidnapped, used. The situation becomes quite complex, even for our local employees. Security is fragile. It's deteriorating tremendously over the last 2 years in particular. So that's our number one preoccupation. It's a situation of insecurity affecting the entire population. Mr. England, do you have any comments from observations on the ground? I believe you're in mute, Mr. England. Yes, thank you. I would confirm everything that Denise has just said. The situation is extremely concerning. We had to close our office a few months ago because of the high level of insecurity and a very severe impact on the population. This whole issue of access is very, very significant. We have no access. Humanitarian aid cannot reach the people. Medical workers, doctors are not working in any sense of security. Ambulances are being attacked. And we're there to try to negotiate with those who are armed, threatening violence, to try to improve access of various services and assistance to particular communities who need this aid. This absence of access to any kind of assistance is very, very concerning. And we don't have any means to reach them. Not much attention is being brought to bear on this situation in Haiti. There are a number of other crises everywhere else also that are lacking concern. Okay, what do we do to try to overcome this lack of access? What can Canada do? What can Western countries do to improve security or assure security? Food security, for example. I know it's a huge issue. It's been like that for over 50 years in Haiti, but is there any measures that we could take that would be a quick fix or at least an advance? Canada is one of Haiti's major humanitarian partners. We're significant, and we do have a voice. We have an entire voice to the Haitian government. Canada is a large contributor financially to development aid. And at the last earthquake, for example, in Haiti, we were providing expertise to local communities and committees for public safety to assist them in evaluating the situation in isolated regions because they had no means of their own to do that. Canada should exercise its diplomatic skills to try to find solutions with Haiti. But it's an extremely, extremely complicated situation. Anything to add on that, Mr. England? Well, this security situation has faced a number of serious issues for many, many years. Various Canadian regimes have tried to assist without any success for decades now. It is extremely complex. And again, I would have to agree with Denise that the continuity of the support to the basic services to assure survival of the population are lacking. A number of partners have tried to work with the authorities, the state, electoral supervision or observation, for example, humanitarian aid delivery. We should really take a look at the situation which has been long-standing, and there's very little confidence or trust in the local authorities. Canada is in a good position, however, to try to influence the situation. A more general question, if I may. We've seen it through the situation in Ukraine. The world has gathered to impose massive sanctions, which will have terrible consequences for the population, of course. Economically, people live there. They have to get by. One state has called for war on another, but they're going to suffer from the economic sanctions. The same thing in Afghanistan. We don't particularly have confidence in the government or the state. So how can we intervene in an equitable fashion to not perturb and disturb too much the population? I know it's a huge question, but Mr. England, comments, please. It's quite clear that states will use the assets they have to try to act in a given context. There's a very clear message that sanctions have unintended consequences, and there are consequences immediately. But what would work is collective action, so that sanctions are imposed simultaneously, in order to ensure not only the operations of humanitarian agencies, so not without being selfish here, of course, but we have to be there. Thank you very much, Mr. England and Madame Burns.
To Mr. Bouleris, you have 7 minutes.
Monsieur Bouleris, vous avez 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît. Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for attending this evening on these very important subject. It's huge, complex. Mr. England, a lot of children, Canadian children, are captive in Syrian camps. Daesh children, we might call them. One child has been repatriated, but there are about 24, 25 other children that are caught in these camps. What can Canada do? What should Canada do? Do better or do more of so that we can repatriate them with their Canadian families here? Thank you. Thank you for that question. We are very preoccupied with the situation of children in particular, or families that are trapped in this situation. The country of provenance of these children are doing their best to try to repatriate these children, whether adults or children. And they have to be dealt with in an equitable fashion from a legal point of view. To reestablish the family union, which is a significant part of society. So Canadians that are in these camps should be repatriated one way or another, either through the social system or the justice system. And for children, it's even more urgent. And I can't give you any details of these 24 or 25 cases, but we should take a look at this and see what can be done in individual cases. We have to try to unify families, not separate them, and remove the children as best we can. These are going to be damaged children because of this situation. Quite recently, 3 weeks ago, there was an attack on the northwest of the country, and we have not yet found we have not found a situation or a solution to the foreigners who are working in humanitarian aid. Well, thank you. It's a very significant problem and issue, particularly in Quebec. Madam Burns, I'm pleased to be able to ask you a question on somewhat off track of what we've been discussing for the last hour. Oxfam Quebec, what's the importance of equity to access to vaccines? We're talking pandemic here. What can Canada do further to set aside the patents, because there's a heck of a lot going on worldwide with access to these vaccines. Absolutely. Oxfam is going to publish an update report. The number of deaths is much higher in countries that have moderate or low revenues compared to Canada. And other countries are more or less isolated from it. Brazil, India, they were hit hard by the lack of treatment, therapies, or vaccines. Death rates are much higher in these countries, but they're rarely documented completely. When we think of Canada, we say, well, we're over the hump for the pandemic, but the situation has been lasting since the onset of this pandemic in other countries. So we have to take a look and make sure that these patents are not guarded territory to pharmaceuticals, big pharma. I mean, they've got their payoff, their profits. It's been phenomenal for them. People die because they don't have access to vaccines or therapy. Children are losing their mothers, their parents. We've noticed an increase statistically of many children who no longer have parents because of this pandemic. We have, I think, the means to play a role, a much clearer role. We've not said yes, we've not said no in Canada to the issue of these patent protection. Some countries are for it, many are against it, but Canada's on the fence. It has not yet declared a position. We'd like to have Canada say, yes, it's a matter of equity, of social justice, and women and children are those that suffer the most because they're the first line that we have to defend. Thank you, Madam Burns. That's what we hear, too, on this issue, this relaxation of the patents. And, of course, it's a split discussion here within government in Canada. Mr. Turkle, if we have some time, you talked of the Uyghur situation in China, a situation which is of great interest and concern to the Canadian government. Genocide, suppression of rights, forced labor, slave labor. You also spoke of the Muslim population in India. I don't know too much about that file. But what's going on there? What is happening with them? We don't read about it in the press that much.
As part of my government role at USERF, we monitor 29 countries under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And India has been sounding alarms in the last few years. And the trend line is deeply disturbing. And this is one area that everyone needs to be focused. As discussed earlier, much of the rhetoric, the hatred, racism, Islamophobia is actually quietly promoted by the government officials. If it's not a state policy, but very subtly. We've seen this in China. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it elsewhere. One significant problem that we all have to think about and dealt with is in the last 10 years, the international community have experienced at least 3 known genocides, starting with Yazidis and the Rohingyas, the Muslim Uyghurs in China. And I'm afraid that the Muslim population in India might be meeting with a similar type of fate. There are more than 150 countries, state parties to the Genocide Convention. In the Uyghur genocide, there are only 8 countries and parliaments have recognized. So the rest of the world, the rest of the state parties to this important legal tool, mechanism, still sleeping at switch, if not they're willfully ignoring. They're failing to fulfill their treaty obligation. So if you don't act, if you don't show leadership, the bad actors will be getting a bad idea, the encouragement and emboldened. And we're seeing this repeatedly everywhere around the world. The human rights, religious freedom policies, positions should be a key component of our foreign policy approach. Otherwise, we'll end up dealing with a humanitarian disaster, national security threats.
Thank you, Mr. Turkel. Allow me to thank all 3 witnesses, Mr. Turkel, Ms. Burns, and Mr. England. We're grateful for your testimony and for taking our questions. Now, for the members, we do have committee business. So if I could ask that you each get out of this meeting and use the link that's been provided for in-committee business. Thank you.